close your eyes and drift back to a time when empires rose not from peace, but from the fire and steel of ambition. When oceans were crossed not for adventure, but for gold, glory, and souls. Tonight, I'll take you on a journey through one of the most haunting and fascinating episodes in human history, the Spanish Conquest of the Americas, a tale wrapped in shimmering myths and blood-soaked truths, told not from the cold distance of textbooks, but like an old fireside story, passed down from someone who still remembers the echo of musket fire and the scent of burning incense drifting through Tenochtitlan's sacred streets. You will hear of a young, determined conquistador named Hernán Cortés, whose journey from Cuba to the heart of the Aztec Empire was as much a gamble as it was a crusade. Of Montezuma, a ruler touched by prophecy, trapped in a web of destiny and fear. Of gods mistaken for men, and men who believed themselves chosen by God. And yet, this is not just a story of conquest and war. It's a story of encounters, of two worlds colliding in language, culture, belief, and resistance. It is a tale woven with quiet moments too, the breath of jungle wind against a soldier's cheek, the sorrowful chants in Nahuatl echoing through a temple at dusk, the silent tears of a woman named Melanson, whose voice translated an empire into collapse. You won't just learn what happened, you'll feel it, as though you are walking beside them, not as a warrior, but as a silent observer under the stars, letting the story lull you into slumber. So wherever you are listening from, whether from the quiet stillness of your bedroom in London, a night shift break in New York, or a rainy evening in Manila, take a moment. Let me know in the comments below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I love reading through each of your answers. It connects us across oceans and time zones, united by our curiosity and need for rest. Don't forget to like this video if you find peace in these stories, and subscribe if you'd like more journeys through the forgotten corners of the past. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. Long before sails appeared on the horizon and the sound of foreign drums echoed in strange tongues, there was a world that thrived in rhythm with the sun and stars. It was a land not untouched by war, nor innocent of ambition, but it held its own truth, a truth written in obsidian blades, in the feathers of quetzals, in the chant of priests, beneath the shadow of towering temples. The Central Valley of Mexico, a cradle of ancient power, was dominated by the Aztec Empire, or as they knew themselves, the Mexica. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, rose like a jewel from the waters of Lake Texcoco, not merely a city, but a floating marvel of canals, causeways, and stepped pyramids. In the early morning, mist would cling to the surface of the lake, while farmers known as Chinampas guided their canoes through man-made floating gardens. Birds called gently from the reeds. Traders from distant lands arrived with jaguar pelts, cacao, turquoise, and obsidian. At the center, the Templo Mayor loomed, twin temples devoted to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war, and Tlaloc, the god of rain. But beneath the beauty, there pulsed an empire forged by conquest. The Mexica had built their dominion through might, exacting tribute from surrounding city-states, cacao beans, cloth, warriors, even human captives. Fear was a currency, yet so too was reverence. Their ceremonies honored cycles of death and rebirth, a constant negotiation with the gods to keep the sun rising, to ensure rain would fall. And above all, there was prophecy, old omens, sacred calendars, visions that a foreign people would one day arrive from the east, riding deer-sized beasts, clothed in metal, to end the world as they knew it. Still, the Mexica were not alone. Scattered across the region were many nations, some bitter under Aztec domination, others deeply spiritual, proud, and self-reliant. One such place was Tlaxcala, nestled in the highlands, fiercely independent and no stranger to battle. They had resisted the Aztecs for years, holding their traditions close and alliances tighter. To the east lay the humid jungles of Tabasco and Veracruz, where the remnants of Maya civilization still breathed. Though their great cities had declined centuries earlier, their knowledge of the stars and time remained unsurpassed. Their scribes still etched glyphs into stone. Their priests still watched the sky. The memory of Palenque, Capon, and Tikal lingered like voices in the jungle vines. These were not primitive peoples. Their cities rivaled those of Europe in size and complexity. Their languages, Nahuatl, Maya, Mixtec, Zapotec, were rich, poetic, and ancient. Their mathematics included the concept of zero long before it was known in the West. Their calendars charted time in great cosmic wheels, and their philosophies wrestled with fate, sacrifice, and the duality of life. And so, while Europe clawed its way out of medieval darkness, consumed by the fires of Reformation, greed, and empire, this side of the world thrived in its own brilliance, but change was coming. Far across the Atlantic, winds of ambition stirred in Spain, a nation fresh from the Reconquista, hungry for expansion, emboldened by the belief in its divine right to convert and conquer. The Catholic monarchs had driven out the Moors. Their new empire looked westward now, across unknown seas, in pursuit of gold, spices, and salvation. And in 1492, when Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean, it was not Asia he found, but an entire hemisphere, brimming with unfamiliar peoples and rich in resources. Within a generation, wave after wave of Spaniards arrived, not as pilgrims, but as conquistadors. Soldiers, priests, slaves, adventurers, all chasing rumors of cities of gold, of rivers paved with jewels, of empires waiting to be plucked like overripe fruit. Yet the Mexica knew nothing of Spain. The vast ocean had separated their worlds for millennia. They knew only the strange signs in the sky, comets, eclipses, and a vision of a flaming man riding across the heavens. Whispers began to circulate. Could this be the return of Quetzalcoatl, the exiled god, the serpent with feathers, destined to return from the east? In the year 1517, the first small Spanish expedition landed along the Yucatan coast. It was met with resistance and confusion. Some natives saw gods, others saw ghosts. The Spanish saw only opportunity. By 1519, word had spread of a vast empire inland, one rich in silver, gold, and warriors. That same year, a man named Hernán Cortés defied orders and set sail from Cuba with a small fleet. His ambition was not sanctioned, but it burned too brightly to be ignored. Unknowingly, the world was turning its breath inward, a slow inhale before the storm. Two worlds, ancient and emerging, were about to meet not as guests, but as flames upon dry grass. And yet, in that stillness before contact, in that brief heartbeat of history, everything remained intact. Temples still stood. Prayers still rose with the incense. The people danced. The gods were honored. The conquest had not yet begun, but the horizon was darkening. And in the silence before thunder, sometimes, we hear the whispers clearest. In the dusty town of Medellin, nestled within the rolling hills of Extremadura, Spain, a child was born in 1485. His name was Hernán Cortés. From the start, he was marked not by nobility, but by an itch, an unshakable restlessness, as if his soul knew that the world he was born into was too small. His family were minor hidalgos, low-ranking nobility, without much land or wealth, clinging to pride and old names, but lacking the power that once upheld them. They placed hope in books and law, sending young Hernán to study at the University of Salamanca at just 14, but he was no scholar. The classrooms felt like cages, and the legal texts had none of the fire he craved. He stayed just 2 years before vanishing from the academic world. Restless, quick-witted, and charismatic, he wasn't meant for parchment. He was meant for action. And across the sea, opportunity called. The stories were already spreading across Spain, stories of Columbus, of strange islands to the west, of native peoples adorned in gold, of fertile lands and endless promise. It was the dawn of a new age, and young men like Cortés could see it, not just as destiny, but as escape. Escape from anonymity, escape from poverty, escape into the pages of history. At around 19, Cortés boarded a ship and set sail for Hispaniola, the Spanish colony that had grown from Columbus's first expeditions. It was the gateway to the New World, a strange, dangerous place where fortunes were made by sword and sweat. He arrived with little. No title, no wealth, just ambition sharper than steel. In Hispaniola and later in Cuba, Cortés proved himself clever, adaptable, and bold. He took part in local campaigns against the Taino people, learned how to manipulate colonial politics, and earned the favor of influential leaders, including Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba. Velázquez gave him land, slaves, and responsibilities. Cortés was now part of the colonial elite, yet still, it was not enough. He listened closely to the whispers carried by native traders and scouts, tales of a great civilization to the west, beyond the jungles and mountains. Cities rich in gold, ruled by kings clad in feathered headdresses. The name of this fabled land, Mexico. And so, when Velázquez began assembling an expedition to explore this territory, Cortés made certain he would lead it. He used flattery, political pressure, and even romantic entanglements, including with Velázquez's own sister-in-law. To secure the role, the governor grew suspicious, sensing the ambition behind Cortés's soft-spoken words, and tried to revoke the commission. But Cortés had already begun preparations. With a fleet of 11 ships, a few hundred men, horses, cannons, and supplies, he departed Santiago de Cuba in February 1519 without official sanction. It was an act of mutiny cloaked in purpose. Among his company were not just soldiers, but sailors, craftsmen, scribes, and adventurers. Many came for gold, others for salvation. Some had nothing to lose. Few understood the depth of the journey they had begun. Cortés carried with him more than weapons. He carried strategy. He understood that conquest would not come through brute force. They were too few for that. No, this would be a conquest of the mind and spirit. Divide and conquer. Befriend the enemy of your enemy. Play God when needed. Burn bridges behind you. And always, always push forward. He was no hero, but neither was he a simple villain. Like many men shaped by empire, faith, and greed, he was a reflection of his time, a storm wearing a human face. As they sailed west, past the mangrove shores and emerald jungles of the Yucatan, his men stared wide-eyed at the coastline. The land seemed ancient, as if older than time itself. The air was thick with heat and the scent of blooming orchids. In the trees, monkeys called, and soon they would hear drums. They landed first near the coast of Tabasco, where they would meet resistance and fire their first muskets in this new campaign. But even before that clash, Cortés's mind was already at work. He knew this wasn't just about surviving. It was about unraveling a civilization, thread by thread. But he needed something he didn't yet have. He needed a voice. And soon, fate would give him one, a woman whose name would become etched into legend and betrayal, memory and myth, Melanson. Still, for now, the ships sailed onward. Behind them, Cuba faded into the mist. Ahead, the land of the Mexico waited, unaware that destiny now rode the tide, and Cortés, standing at the helm, eyes sharp as the edge of his sword, was ready. He had not come for exploration. He had come for an empire. And in the shadows of the palm-lined shores, the drums of the old gods began to beat, slowly, steadily, as if warning the land of the stranger now upon it. The coastline of Tabasco glimmered under the humid weight of the March sun in 1519. Thick mangroves rose like emerald walls from the marshes, their roots twisting into the earth like the fingers of old gods. Birds shrieked from unseen branches. The water, brackish and slow, carried whispers in the wind, whispers of foreign sails. The Spanish ships cut through the bay near the mouth of the Grijalva River, named only recently after an earlier expedition. Cortés, still watching with calculating eyes, ordered his men to prepare. Shields, muskets, crossbows, armor. The landing was not meant to be ceremonial. They knew resistance was likely. And resistance, indeed, awaited them. The Chontal Maya of Patanchán, seasoned warriors of this river-bound region, had no desire to host strangers in steel. They had already witnessed violence during the earlier Grijalva expedition. The Spanish promises of peace rang hollow. This time, they would not wait. As Cortés's forces pushed inland, they were met not with parley, but with spears and arrows. The jungle exploded with motion. Maya warriors, painted and feathered, emerged from the underbrush like living spirits of the land. Their weapons, atlatls, obsidian-tipped spears, stone clubs, met steel in the wet heat of battle. At first, the Chontal fought with ferocity. They knew the land. They moved swiftly, striking and vanishing, testing the Spaniards' strength. But they had never seen cavalry. They had never heard cannon. Cortés unleashed both. The horses, strange, thundering beasts, terrified the defenders. To many, man and horse seemed one creature, a god riding an animal spirit of war. When the Spanish artillery opened fire, the thunder of the blasts echoed through the trees. Smoke roiled, trees cracked, and men, brave and bold, fell. It was the Battle of Centla, the first true confrontation between the Spanish and a major Mesoamerican force. Cortés, despite his inferior numbers, won not just through strength, but through shock. The aftermath was brutal. Bodies were burned. Wounded warriors groaned beneath the fronds. But even as the flames cooled, the Chontal knew what must be done. Like so many others would in the coming years, they turned to diplomacy. They sent emissaries bearing gifts, not just jade and gold, though those were given, but food, cloth, and something far more curious: 20 enslaved women. It was not an uncommon practice. Women were often given as tribute to seal peace after conflict. Yet for Cortés, this moment became a turning point, not of violence, but of language. Among those women was Melanson, later known as Doña Marina. Her story is often blurred by centuries of myth. But what is clear is this: she was not Maya. She was Nahua, the same people as the Mexica, born likely in a noble family near the region of Coatzacoalcos. After her father died, her mother remarried and sold her into slavery, a betrayal that shaped her fate. By the time Cortés received her, she had already lived in the households of Maya lords. She had survived. She had listened, and crucially, she had learned. When Cortés discovered that Melanson could speak both Nahuatl and Maya, and that Geronimo de Aguilar could speak Maya and Spanish. A chain of translation was formed, awkward at first, but miraculous in its effect. Spanish to Maya, Maya to Nahuatl. Cortés's words, through this fragile bridge, could now reach the heart of Mexico. Melancin's presence changed everything. Cortés saw her potential quickly. She was intelligent, observant, and fluent. In time, she would speak Spanish fluently, eliminating the need for Aguilar. But even from the start, she did more than translate. She interpreted. She advised. She listened for nuance, and she spoke with authority. To the native peoples they encountered, she was not merely a voice, she was his voice. A woman in a world ruled by men, yet shaping history with every word she uttered. As peace settled over Tabasco, Cortés ordered the fleet to move north, sailing once more toward the coast of Veracruz. But before departure, a final offering was made. From the natives of Tabasco, Cortés received an object simple yet dazzling. A golden mask studded with jade, meant to depict a god. More importantly, he was told where it had come from. They spoke of a land to the west, ruled by a powerful empire, a city of temples and canals, a people who worshipped the sun and demanded tribute from all. The word they used was Mexica. It was the first time Cortés had heard the name. His interest ignited into obsession. An empire, a city of gold, a ruler known as Montezuma. He would need to meet this emperor, not as a visitor, but as a rival. A challenge disguised in courtesy. But before that, something more symbolic had to be done. They anchored at a spot further up the coast, on firm, dry land. There, Cortés ordered the construction of Villarica de la Vera Cruz, the rich town of the True Cross. It was a political move, disguised as a founding. By creating a new town, he was able to appeal directly to the King of Spain, bypassing Governor Velázquez entirely. He named himself Captain General under royal authority. He had rewritten the chain of command. To ensure loyalty, he called his officers together and revealed his plan. He would lead an expedition inland, not just to explore, to conquer. Some hesitated. A few plotted to escape and sail home. That's when he did the unthinkable. He ordered the ships to be scuttled and burned. One by one, the very vessels that had brought them here were dismantled, destroyed, or sunk. There would be no escape, no retreat, only the land ahead, and whatever waited beyond the hills. The men protested, some in rage, others in terror, but Cortés stood firm. "We go forward," he said, "to win or to die." It was madness. It was genius. It was the moment the conquest truly began. And as smoke rose from the blackened hulls, drifting over the waves like ash from a forgotten altar, the drums in the forests behind them seemed to quicken, calling, warning. The gods were watching. Her name, like her story, has many faces. Melancin, Melanali, Doña Marina. To some, she was a traitor. To others, a survivor. To Cortés, she was indispensable. To history, she is a question still unanswered. When the Chontal Maya handed over the 20 enslaved women after the Battle of Sentla, no one in that moment realized they were also handing over the key to an empire. Among the group, she did not look different, barefoot, silent, no jewelry, eyes cast low. Yet, the threads of her fate stretched farther than even she could imagine. She had been born around 1500, possibly in the region near the present-day border of Veracruz and Tabasco, into a noble Nahua family, the same ethnic group that ruled the Mexican Empire. Her early life was shattered by political betrayal. Her father died, her mother remarried, and in a quiet and final act of erasure, Melanson was given away, either sold into slavery or abandoned, and eventually passed into Maya hands. Years passed. Names changed, but she endured. By the time she stood before Cortés, she was fluent in both Nahuatl and the dialects of her Maya captors. And though she could not yet speak Spanish, she recognized power when she saw it. She recognized, too, that her life had just entered a new chapter. Cortés quickly realized her value, with Geronimo de Aguilar translating from Spanish to Maya, and Melanson translating from Maya to Nahuatl. The conquistadors suddenly held a bridge, a fragile but functioning chain of communication between worlds that had never spoken to each other before. Imagine it. 3 people, seated by firelight, surrounded by guards and candles, turning each thought through 2 languages before it could be understood. A name, an idea, a threat, all passing through the narrow corridor of shared breath. At first, she was just a translator, but she listened, she watched, and in time, she learned Spanish faster than anyone expected. She became Cortés's direct link, not just with the Aztec world, but with every indigenous group along the way. But her role was more than language. Melanson understood the social rules of Nahua diplomacy, the weight of words, the careful games of etiquette and status. When Cortés would misstep in his arrogance, she would smooth the edge. When a local chief hesitated, she would gently, calmly, push forward the illusion that the Spanish were messengers of fate. She knew how to make the impossible feel inevitable. To the native peoples they encountered, she was strange, a native woman who dressed in Spanish clothing, who moved freely among the soldiers, who spoke for the man in armor. Many feared her. Some admired her. Some called her a sorceress. But what did she feel? We can only guess. History has few of her words. No diary, no voice of her own survives. But from the accounts of those around her, it is clear she was neither passive nor powerless. She argued, she advised. At one point, she even uncovered a plot against Cortés, warning him before an ambush could occur. He trusted her more than most of his officers. Some nights, she and Cortés would speak alone. He learned her story. She learned his intentions. Whether by strategy, affection, or both, they became lovers. She bore him a son, Martin, who would become one of the first mestizo children in New Spain, the living symbol of two worlds colliding, a child of sword and smoke, blood and ash, but also of tongues that once could not speak to each other. But Melanson was not merely Cortés's concubine. She walked beside him through negotiations, stood by him during key confrontations, and even accompanied him into Tenochtitlan. There she would meet Montezuma, the emperor of her ancestors, and she would speak for the man who would bring him down. Many historians have debated her choices. Could she have resisted? Was she manipulated? Did she believe in the Spanish cause? Or did she simply seek survival in a world where women were tools of politics and war? Some later Mexican narratives painted her as a traitor, a malinquista, a name used even today to describe someone who betrays their culture in favor of foreigners. Yet those who lived closest to the conquest, like Bernal Diaz, described her with respect and even reverence. One thing is certain: without Melanson, the conquest could not have unfolded the way it did. Time and again, she prevented misunderstandings that might have ended in blood. She convinced rulers to meet with Cortés. She turned hostile chiefs into allies. And when threats came from within, such as the mutiny Cortés faced in Veracruz, she saw the danger and warned him before it could ignite. She chose her position. She was not only a victim of history, she shaped it. And for that, her legacy has never rested easily. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, she continued to serve Cortés as an interpreter and envoy. When he traveled to Honduras in 1524, she went with him, a testament to her enduring place in his mind and in his plans. Eventually, she was married off to a Spanish nobleman, Juan Jaramillo, and faded from the central stage. Her final years are a whisper. Like so many women in the long corridors of empire, her light dimmed once her usefulness waned. But still, we remember her, not just as the translator of an empire, not just as the woman behind the man, but as a symbol of broken chains, broken languages, and the fragile humanity caught between two worlds. Imagine her standing at the edge of a great lake, watching the city of Tenochtitlan rise in the early mist. Behind her, steel glints in the morning sun. Ahead, temples glow like gold. She says nothing, but she understands everything. She, more than anyone, knows what is about to happen. And in her silence, the empires tremble. The sea had always been a comfort to the Spanish. It was familiar, obedient to wind and command, and it tethered them to the world they knew. Spain, Cuba, the Caribbean. The ships were their lifeline, their sanctuary, their promise of return. But Hernán Cortés understood something more primal, more dangerous. If you give men a road back, they will take it. But if you take the road away, they'll fight like gods to make a new one. And so, in a decision as theatrical as it was strategic, Cortés burned his ships. Some say he scuttled them, dismantled them under the pretense of repairs. Others claim they were torched, their hulls blackened against the sea like sacrificial offerings to fate. Whatever the method, the meaning was unmistakable. There would be no return. The reaction among his men was immediate fury, disbelief, panic. Diego de Ordaz, Pedro de Alvarado, and others demanded explanation. Cortés offered it plainly. If we go back now, we will be fugitives. But if we press forward, we win a kingdom. It was bold. It was madness. But it worked. In this act, he destroyed the last memory of safety and replaced it with singular focus. From that day, every step forward was not just part of a mission, it was survival. There was no one to rescue them now. No fleet in waiting. No governor's pardon. Only the jungle, the mountains, and beyond them, Tenochtitlan. Cortés had with him fewer than 600 men. He had 16 horses, a handful of cannons, a few dozen crossbows. He was outnumbered by the thousands, in a land he did not understand, but he had something no native power had seen before: ruthless conviction, military discipline, and most importantly, a gift for turning enemies into allies. He began with the local Totonac peoples along the coast near Veracruz. They lived under the shadow of Aztec power, forced to pay tribute: feathers, cacao, jade, and slaves. When Cortés arrived, not with threats, but with open arms, they listened. He promised liberation, protection, an end to the flow of tribute to Tenochtitlan. And so they allied with him. It was the beginning of a pattern that would play out again and again. Cortés was no simple invader. He was a chess master, moving pieces with quiet precision, pitting old rivals against one another, cracking the great Mexican Empire from within. Still, the journey inland was treacherous. They marched through dense forests, where heat dripped from the trees and strange insects buzzed at their ears. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Armor grew heavy. Horses limped. The jungle whispered with unseen eyes. Food ran short. The path was uncertain. But forward they pressed. At every village, Cortés sent envoys ahead, bearing gifts, kind words, and behind them, the silent presence of steel and thunder. Some towns welcomed them, others resisted, only to find themselves crushed by cannon or betrayed by neighbors. Malintzin, ever at Cortés's side, spoke softly in these encounters, convincing rulers that the Spanish were not enemies, but messengers of a greater power. Some even began to believe the old prophecies, that pale-skinned strangers would return from the east, led by a god, to change the world. Cortés didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. One day, the Spanish received a message from Montezuma himself, delivered by finely dressed emissaries who arrived with feathered fans and gold trinkets. The emperor welcomed them from afar, sent gifts, but also warnings. The road to the capital was difficult. The emperor was busy. He could not receive them. It was diplomacy as defense. Montezuma, in his palaces of white stone and turquoise, was watching from afar, troubled by omens. A comet, strange lights in the sky, an eclipse, all interpreted by priests as signs of doom. And now, these strangers, whose weapons roared like thunder, whose beasts had never been seen, whose female interpreters spoke Nahuatl like a noblewoman, were coming closer. He hesitated, and Cortés pushed forward. The army next approached Sempala, a large Totonac city. Its leaders welcomed the Spanish eagerly. They had long suffered under Aztec oppression. When Cortés promised to help them resist, they swore allegiance to Spain, not understanding what that allegiance truly meant. In the city's great square, under banners and drums, the Spaniards performed a strange ritual. They erected a wooden cross, destroyed the idols in the temples, and declared Christianity the true faith. Some natives were confused, others frightened, but the city did not resist. Not yet. Cortés knew he had to make a bold political move to secure his rebellion against Governor Velázquez. And so, in Villarica de la Vera Cruz, he persuaded, or pressured, his men to formally elect a municipal council, which in turn confirmed Cortés as their lawful captain general, acting under the king's authority. He now had a legitimate claim, at least on paper. He sent letters to King Charles V, filled with gold and promises. The conquest was not a rogue mission anymore. It was royal, sanctified, and so, standing on the coast of a continent not his own, surrounded by allies he could barely trust, and leading an army too small for the task before it, Cortés prepared for the next step, the march into the heart of Mexico. He knew what lay ahead: a mighty empire, a divine emperor, a city on water, and between him and that city, mountains, enemies, and 1,000 ways to die. But the ships were gone. The coast behind him burned, and the road forward was the only one left. In war, there are moments when doubt must be drowned by fire. This was such a moment. The land began to change as the Spanish and their native allies moved inland. Gone were the damp heat and tangled mangroves of the coast. The earth grew firmer beneath their boots. Forests of towering pine and oak emerged. Streams flowed cool and fast, cut deep into volcanic rock. The birdsong shifted, softer, more distant, and the nights began to chill. The army, now numbering over 1,000 with the support of local Totonac warriors, climbed steadily toward the Mexican highlands. The Sierra Madre Oriental loomed ahead, its spine stretching like a giant coiled serpent, snow still clinging to the highest ridges, even as the summer sun beat down. It was not just a physical climb, but a symbolic one. They were leaving the lowlands, a place of small city-states and local alliances, and ascending toward the heartland of Mexica power. Each step forward tightened the rope between Cortés and Montezuma, and though their armies were still days apart, their strategies had already begun to dance. But the journey was far from peaceful. Some towns welcomed the Spaniards with deference, not because they believed them gods, but because they feared Aztec retaliation if they resisted. Others offered tribute, corn, fowl, chocolate, and gold ornaments, always gold. Cortés would handle the gifts like a priest handles relics, weighing each piece not by value, but by what it told him. Gold, he realized, was everywhere. Small discs, hollow beads, nose rings, and diadems. Some were made into the faces of gods, others into animal shapes. It was not merely wealth to these people. It was sacred, a gift of the sun. But to the Spanish, it was confirmation that the tales of an empire glittering with treasure were true. Each trinket was a whisper, more lies ahead. But the road was not paved with generosity. In the region near the town of Tenochtitlán, they were met with resistance. A village loyal to the Mexica tried to ambush a Spanish scouting party, leading to a brief but bloody skirmish. Steel sliced through obsidian, the clash ringing out in the forest like bells. The Spanish emerged victorious, but not unscathed. Each fight taught Cortés something new. He saw how the native armies moved fast, coordinated, and fearless. He saw how they communicated with drums and smoke signals. And he learned that the Mexica, while feared, were not beloved by all. Every village seemed to carry old grudges, bruises from past tribute demands, memories of brothers taken for sacrifice. He exploited each one. Melanson continued her tireless work, negotiating, interpreting, even spying. In one town, she overheard a plot to attack the Spanish camp during the night. She quietly informed Cortés, who then staged a preemptive show of force. The town backed down, and the Spanish marched on. One morning, the army awoke to see the snow-covered peak of Popocatépetl in the distance, the great smoking mountain, sacred to many native peoples. The air was thin here. Many soldiers coughed and staggered. Horses slipped on loose stones, but morale held. They reached the town of Cuauhtémoc, one of the largest cities in Mesoamerica. It was a beautiful place, wide avenues, whitewashed temples, bustling markets. The Great Pyramid of Cuauhtémoc, now partly overgrown with earth and grass, rose like a mountain of stone, larger in base than any pyramid in Egypt. The people were refined, artistic, and deeply religious. They welcomed the Spaniards with elaborate ceremony, offering them fine cloaks, feather fans, cacao, and precious stones. But Cortés was suspicious. He had heard rumors that Montezuma had ordered Cuauhtémoc's leaders to trap the Spaniards within the city and massacre them. The sources were unclear. Some came from his allies in Tlaxcala, others from whispers passed through Melanson. Cortés made a decision. He summoned the nobles of Cuauhtémoc to the city square. Spanish troops, hidden nearby, waited in silence. Then, as Cortés gave the signal, the massacre began. Steel flashed. Muskets cracked. The square became a slaughterhouse. It was one of the most controversial acts of the entire conquest, an event still debated to this day. Cortés claimed it was preemptive self-defense, that he had uncovered a conspiracy. Others say it was a brutal lesson meant to terrify the empire into submission. Either way, the streets of Caligula ran red. Hundreds died. Flames rose into the blue mountain sky. And across the region, word spread like wildfire. The Spaniards were not gods. They were demons in armor, but they could not be stopped. And then, something unexpected happened. The people of Tlaxcala, ancient enemies of the Mexica, sent emissaries to meet Cortés. They had long resisted Aztec dominance, fiercely independent and proud, though they had initially fought the Spanish in a series of brutal skirmishes, losing hundreds to the cavalry and cannon. They now saw an opportunity. If the Spanish were willing to destroy Caligula, perhaps they could be useful. Cortés entered Tlaxcala as an honored guest. Banquets were held, agreements made, warriors pledged. He had done it again, turned an old enemy of the Mexica into an ally of Spain. The Tlaxcalans would become Cortés's most loyal indigenous partners. Tens of thousands of warriors would march beside the Spanish to Tenochtitlan, eager for revenge, for glory, for the end of Aztec tyranny. And so, on a crisp morning, with smoke from the mountains still drifting low in the valleys, the army assembled once more. The banners of Spain fluttering in the wind, the flowered cloaks of Tlaxcalan captains, the burning eyes of Cortés, and the calm silence of Melanson. Ahead lay the final road, and beyond it, the city of Tenochtitlan. They would see it soon. They had no idea what they were walking into, but the gods surely did. If the Aztecs ruled like an empire, then the Tlaxcalans resisted like a republic. High in the valleys of central Mexico, surrounded by peaks and rivers, they had defied Mexica domination for nearly a century. They were seasoned warriors, fiercely independent, and locked in a brutal rhythm of ritual war called the Flower Wars. Fought not for conquest, but for captives to feed the gods. It was these same Flower Wars that had carved deep scars between Tlaxcala and Tenochtitlan. Their fields had been raided, their people taken for sacrifice, yet they had never been conquered, never bent the knee. Now they watched with careful eyes as Cortés and his foreign army approached, and at first they fought. It was late August, 1519. The Spanish had just passed into Tlaxcalan territory, and scouts reported signs of movement ahead. Within days, skirmishes erupted, vicious, fast, and relentless. The Tlaxcalan warriors, painted and feathered, struck with obsidian blades, blowing conch shells, and charging with shrill cries. They moved in waves, using slings, spears, and wooden shields, testing the resolve of the invaders. But the Spanish held firm. Steel swords cut through armor of cotton and reeds. Crossbows thudded, cavalry charged, and here Cortés's advantage showed most. The horses, still unknown to the native peoples, struck terror into even the bravest soldiers. They reared and trampled, thunderous and swift. For 5 days, the battle raged across valleys and ridges. Cortés was nearly overwhelmed more than once. Supplies ran thin, wounds piled high. Still, they did not retreat. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fighting stopped. Cortés sent emissaries, gifts, promises, and the Tlaxcalan leaders, aged, scarred, pragmatic, gathered in council. Among them was Xicotencatl the Elder, a wise statesman, and his son, Xicotencatl the Younger, a bold commander who had led the resistance. There was a long debate. Some argued to continue fighting, to die with honor rather than make pacts with invaders. Others looked at the Spanish weapons, the glinting steel, the roaring cannon, the strange animals, and saw an opportunity. Eventually, the elders prevailed. They invited Cortés to Tlaxcala, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. When the Spaniards entered the city, they were stunned. Tlaxcala was no village. It was a bustling metropolis, vibrant markets, stepped temples, orderly streets lined with stone buildings and painted murals. Thousands gathered to watch the procession. Children ran beside the Spanish horses, touching them in awe. Women peered from rooftops, whispering to one another about the pale-skinned strangers. The Spanish were fed, clothed, and treated for their wounds. Cortés, ever the diplomat, knew what he needed to do. He praised Tlaxcala's resistance. He promised alliance, not dominance. He framed the Mexica as a mutual enemy, an empire of tyranny, a cult of sacrifice. He even participated in local ceremonies, not fully understanding them, but respecting their rhythm. He spoke often to the council, and at every meeting, Melanson translated not just words, but intention. She navigated the cultural space between Spanish pride and Tlaxcalan honor. She softened edges. She carried trust. In return, Cortés gained something more valuable than any gold trinket. He gained an army. Thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors volunteered to march with him. These were not mercenaries. They were men with old scores to settle, families lost to the knife of Mexica priests, sons taken and never returned. For them, this wasn't conquest. It was revenge. But not all were convinced. Xicotencatl the Younger, proud and unyielding, remained suspicious. He saw Cortés not as a liberator, but as another tyrant in different colors. He argued bitterly with his father and the council. He distrusted Melanson. And yet, even he could not stop the tide. Tlaxcala had made its decision. Before departing, the Tlaxcalans prepared a feast. Cortés and his captains sat among local lords beneath canopies of woven flowers. Drums played. Dancers moved in spirals. There was turkey, maize cakes, chocolate spiced with chili. At the center of the ceremony, a symbolic gesture. Tlaxcalan leaders cut their arms and mingled their blood with the Spanish, swearing brotherhood in war. It was more than a pact. It was a turning point. For the first time, the Spanish were not merely outsiders. They had stepped into the complex political web of Mesoamerica. They were now part of an ancient conflict, not just observers. And they had chosen a side. Soon more emissaries came not from Tlaxcala, but from Montezuma. With them, even more lavish gifts, golden masks, feathered cloaks, ornate jewelry. These were not bribes, not anymore. They were warnings. Do not come closer. There is nothing for you in the valley. Turn back. Cortés accepted the gifts and marched forward. The alliance with Tlaxcala had changed everything. No longer a lonely band of soldiers, the Spanish force now moved as a coalition, a crusade, in their own minds. European steel and native fury, side by side. As they prepared to leave, Melanson informed Cortés of something whispered in the Tlaxcalan courts, a growing fear, even among allies. The Mexica had sorcerers, they said. They could call lightning, curse crops, bend the will of enemies. And beyond the next valley, rising like a mirage, stood the island city of Tenochtitlan, a city of stone and water, ruled by a man said to speak with gods. The road ahead would pass through the sacred city of Caligula, an ancient pilgrimage site loyal to Montezuma. Cortés had a decision to make. Push forward and face whatever waited at the foot of the lake, or pause and test the resolve of another imperial subject. He chose to move quickly, but carefully. The army, Spanish, Totonac, and now Tlaxcalan, broke camp in early October. The volcanoes Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl loomed high on the horizon, their snowy peaks glowing in the morning light. They would pass between them through the Valley of Mexico, where eagles soared, where waters shimmered, and where the fate of empires would be decided. In the mountains, alliances are forged in frost and blood. But in the valley below, destinies are sealed. It was a morning like no other, pale light over high ridges, air chilled with the whisper of the heavens, and silence that seemed to stretch across centuries. Cortés stood still at the crest of the pass between two mighty volcanoes, Popocatépetl, the smoking mountain, and Iztaccíhuatl, the sleeping woman. Beneath him, the Valley of Mexico opened like a sacred scroll, a shimmering patchwork of lakes, fields, and villages, extended in every direction. Floating gardens danced along the water's edge, and white causeways sliced across blue like veins in a jade stone. And there, at the heart of it all, a city rising from the lake, Tenochtitlan. It looked like something born not of men, but of gods. Built on a series of islands in Lake Texcoco, the city glistened in the morning sun. Great white temples pierced the sky. Wide causeways stretched like arms from the city to the shore. Canoes dotted the lake in the hundreds, moving silently between chinempas, those fertile, floating gardens that fed thousands. From this height, the city seemed to breathe. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of the Spanish foot soldiers who later wrote a memoir of the conquest, said, "It was like a dream, so many things never seen, never heard of, never dreamed of." The Spanish were stunned, speechless. They had come expecting villages and huts, but here was a city more organized, more vast and beautiful than any they had seen in Europe. Some compared it to Venice, but even that did not quite fit. Tenochtitlan was alive in a way that defied comparison, a place of rhythm, movement, and sacred design. And now they would enter it. But the road was not yet finished. To reach the island city, the Spanish had to descend into the valley and pass through a final series of towns, each one under Mexican influence. Cortés, cautious, sent word ahead to Montezuma, once more announcing his peaceful intent. More gifts arrived: gold, feathers, gemstones, more than ever before. And with them came Montezuma's words, relayed through his stewards. "We welcome you, but the gods are watching. Come with reverence." The deeper the army moved into the valley, the more surreal the world became. Roads were paved with smooth stone. Temples stood at regular intervals, some adorned with bright murals of hummingbirds, eagles, and serpents. People watched from rooftops and market stalls. Not screaming, not cheering, just watching, with eyes full of awe and fear. Word had long since reached the capital. The strangers had arrived, and they had brought the enemies of the Mexico with them. Tlaxcalans, Totonacs, and strange beasts that snorted and trampled. In the city of Iztapalapa, just a day's march from Tenochtitlan, the Spanish were hosted by local lords. There, Cortés saw gardens like nothing in Spain, artificial lakes with stepping stone paths, fountains shaped like animals, rare flowers collected from across the empire. He wandered through them in silence. Some say he wept. Then, finally, came the morning of November 8th, 1519. The sun rose behind the eastern mountains, casting golden light across the lake. The air was still. The causeway stretched ahead, broad and white, flanked by water on either side. Canoes moved silently below, their paddlers watching. And in the distance, along the causeway, a royal entourage approached. Cortés stepped forward. His armor gleamed. Behind him, flags of Castile fluttered. Around him stood the native allies, some tense, others astonished. The procession came closer. Feathered warriors in brilliant costumes, priests with long white robes, servants bearing incense and flowers. And at the center, a tall, regal figure, Montezuma II. He wore a cloak of turquoise, a headdress of quetzal feathers that cascaded like a waterfall of emerald and gold. His face was calm, unreadable, but his posture radiated something unmistakable: power. They stopped a few feet apart. Two worlds, two universes, standing face to face. There was silence. Then Melanson spoke. She knelt and translated the greeting from Cortés. Reverence, peace, friendship from the King of Spain. Montezuma responded with equal gravity, though not as a subordinate. He acknowledged their arrival as fated. The gods, he said, had perhaps willed this. He welcomed them into the city, but his voice, though regal, was heavy. His eyes wandered, and some would later say that he already knew in that moment that the world was about to end. The procession continued into the city. And what a city it was! Wide avenues paved with stone, canals full of flowers and cargo, markets that hummed with life. Tlatelolco, the great marketplace, could host over 40,000 people at once. There were schools, libraries, zoos, homes neatly arranged by district, temples that soared to the heavens, and everywhere order, clean streets, waste removed daily, public baths, running water. Engineers had designed the city with precision and sacred geometry. The Spaniards walked through it like dreamers. They were led to the palace of Axayacatl, Montezuma's father, a vast compound of stone rooms, gardens, and balconies. There they were housed as guests. Food arrived in abundance. Attendants offered them gifts, massages, even entertainers. Montezuma visited often, speaking calmly, offering insight into his people, his gods, his fears. And yet, each day, Cortés walked the streets with his captains. He sketched the city in his mind. He watched the guards. He studied the layout. He asked questions about the temples, especially the great Templo Mayor, where the hearts of captives were still raised to the sun, because he knew this was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The Spanish were inside the heart of the empire, welcomed, fed, entertained, but still outsiders, still armed, still feared. And Cortés, for all his admiration, understood one cold truth. He could not leave this city unless he controlled it. The days passed in uneasy calm. And then a decision was made, bold, reckless, and irreversible. Cortés would seize Montezuma himself. But that tale is for the next breath of night. Because beneath the golden light of Tenochtitlan, a shadow had already begun to grow. Tenochtitlan was not just a city. It was a heartbeat, a sacred engine whose rhythms pulsed through every canal, every temple, every soul beneath its rooftops. And at the center of that heartbeat was one man, Montezuma Zacotzin, Huey Tlatoni, the revered speaker. But now the unthinkable was about to happen. Cortés, who had been fed and honored, welcomed as a guest, was preparing to imprison the emperor. It seems mad, and yet, for Cortés, it was necessary. He stood in the eye of a storm. His army was small, surrounded by thousands of Mexican warriors, lodged in a palace in the heart of the enemy's capital. One whisper from Montezuma, and they could all be wiped from the earth. Cortés's instincts told him to strike first, not with swords, not yet, but with strategy. He had heard troubling news. Back in the Gulf Coast, a Spanish captain named Panfilo de Narvaez had landed with orders to arrest him for disobeying the governor of Cuba. Reinforcements, yes, but also a threat. Cortés was losing time. Worse still, a rumor reached him from Melancon. Montezuma may have been secretly conspiring to cut the Spaniards off. A revolt was brewing. The palace guards were growing in number. Tension hung in the air like smoke before fire. So he made a choice. One morning, under a sun that watched without judgment, Cortés and a small group of trusted soldiers walked calmly to Montezuma's chambers. They came with smiles, small gifts, and quiet voices. They asked to speak in private. Once inside, the doors closed. Cortés's tone changed. He accused Montezuma of treachery, of ordering an attack on Spanish troops near the coast. The emperor was startled, perhaps confused. There's no record of him resisting. Some say he stood in silence, too shocked to believe it. Others suggest he may have sensed his fate all along, the slow machinery of doom turning beneath him. Cortés made it simple. Come with us, Your Majesty. As a guest, of course, for your protection, just a precaution. The great ruler of the Mexican Empire, son of nobles, voice of the gods, walked from his palace into captivity. No chains were placed on him, no iron bars. He was moved gently, almost with honor, into the Spanish quarters inside the palace of Axayacatl. The people outside were told he had gone of his own will, that all was well. But inside, the truth was bare. Montezuma was now a prisoner in his own city. He was given every comfort: his wives, his attendants, his food. His rank was not stripped. He still spoke to his council, gave orders, and received dignitaries, but always under the shadow of Spanish steel. Cortés, for his part, treated Montezuma with careful courtesy. He bowed before him. He allowed his rituals. He even made a show of protecting the emperor from supposed threats. But beneath the civility was a steely hand. Montezuma's power had shifted. He was no longer a divine king. He was a symbol, a puppet, through which Cortés hoped to control the empire. And for a time, it worked. The city remained calm. The marketplaces bustled. Canoes still glided across Lake Texcoco. The priests still lit incense at the temples. Montezuma's voice still echoed in the council halls, but whispers began to stir. The nobility watched. The priests prayed more furiously. Some of the common people, once curious, even friendly, began to speak with suspicion. They saw the Tlaxcalans swagger through their streets. They saw Spanish soldiers lounging with muskets. They heard that the emperor was no longer free, and they remembered the gods who demanded loyalty, who punished weakness, who saw captivity not as compromise, but shame. Meanwhile, Cortés turned his attention to other matters. He had Montezuma order the city's treasury opened to the Spaniards. Gold and jade were brought in, weighed, melted, distributed. The soldiers grew fat with treasure. They carved crosses on the walls, toppled small altars, began Christian prayers in the privacy of their quarters. At night, Montezuma would sometimes sit alone in his chambers, gazing out at the lake. Perhaps he saw the lights of the canoes drifting in the dark. Perhaps he remembered the old omens, the comet, the fire temples, the strange screams in the sky. Perhaps he wondered if he had failed the gods. Then, a storm from the east. Narvaez, the Spanish captain sent to arrest Cortés, had landed with 900 men and heavy artillery. He established camp near Sempala, declaring himself the rightful commander. Word reached Tenochtitlan within days. Cortés knew he couldn't face an enemy from outside while surrounded by potential enemies within. He left Pedro de Alvarado in charge of the city, a proud, harsh man with little patience for native customs, and marched east with a small force to deal with Narvis. What happened next is one of the great tragedies of the conquest. During Cortés's absence, a festival was held in Tenochtitlan, the Feast of Tenochtitlan, in honor of Tezcatlipoca, the god of sorcery and destiny. Thousands gathered, dancers, drums, incense. The city shimmered with devotion. But Alvarado feared a trap. He had seen the warriors in full regalia, the obsidian blades glinting, the songs rising like battle cries. Whether out of panic or cruelty, he struck. Spanish soldiers entered the temple courtyard during the height of the festival and massacred the dancers. The square ran with blood. Men fell with their flutes still at their lips. Women screamed from the rooftops. The drums stopped. When the smoke cleared, Tenochtitlan erupted. The people who had once watched with curiosity, who had whispered in wonder, who had tolerated the invaders under the voice of their god-king, now rose with fury. The streets turned against the Spaniards. Bridges were cut. Supplies vanished. Stones rained from rooftops. Canoes surrounded the lake palace. The city that once welcomed the strangers now tightened around them like a serpent. Cortés would return to a city in full revolt, and with him he would bring fire. But here, for tonight, we pause. The emperor sits behind guarded walls. His gods are silent, his people no longer, and in the night wind, the lake whispers of vengeance. Drums deep as the heartbeat of the earth. Flutes high and mournful, like birds calling to forgotten gods. In the sacred courtyard of the Templo Mayor, the people of Tenochtitlan gathered for one of their most important celebrations, the Feast of Tenochtitlan. The festival honored Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, a god of fate, war, sorcery, and destiny. He was unpredictable, powerful, and cruel if disrespected. And on this day, his essence danced in every motion, every beat of the drum, every flicker of incense. The nobles wore their finest feathered cloaks and gold pendants. Warriors bore costumes of jaguar skins and eagle feathers. Priests chanted, hands lifted to the heavens. It was a ceremony as old as memory, a sacred renewal, meant to cleanse the city and its people for the cycles ahead. But watching from the shadowed balconies of the palace was a man who did not understand. Pedro de Alvarado, tall, proud, quick to anger. Alvarado had been left in command of the city by Cortés, while he marched east to confront the rival Spanish expedition. It was, perhaps, the most fragile moment of the entire conquest. Tenochtitlan was a city of warriors, and Montezuma was no longer free. Alvarado feared revolt, and in the thundering music of Tenochtitlan, he saw not devotion, but danger. The courtyard was filled with unarmed celebrants, dancers, priests, musicians, nobles, their backs turned in rhythm, their minds lost in the sacred. And then came the order. Whether driven by suspicion or sheer cruelty, Alvarado gave the command that would unravel everything. Spanish soldiers, fully armored, swords drawn, moved into the courtyard. They closed the exits. They waited for the music to reach its height. And then they struck. Steel cut through feathers. Drums fell silent, replaced by screams. Blood soaked the stones. Nobles fell clutching their chests. Priests reached for the sky, cut down before they could speak. The dancers were unarmed, unaware. There was no battle, only slaughter. It was not war. It was a massacre. Witnesses said the screams echoed across the city, rising from the Templo Mayor like a cursed wind. Smoke from the torches drifted into the clouds, carrying the scent of burning blood. The sacred ground was defiled. Tezcatlipoca had been dishonored. The people below didn't yet know the full horror, but they felt it. The sound, the silence that followed, the strange movement of Spanish soldiers returning, blood on their boots, hollow eyes behind their helmets. The city stilled, and then it erupted. The people of Tenochtitlan turned in an instant. They barred roads, pulled up causeways, and filled the canals with warriors. Stones, darts, and curses rained down on the palace walls. The air buzzed with fury. Messengers ran to and from the neighborhoods, summoning warriors, summoning vengeance. In every home, in every temple, the cry rose. They killed our gods. They killed our people. Let them drown in their greed. Inside the Spanish quarters, panic set in. Alvarado, realizing what he had done, ordered the gates shut. The compound was fortified, but it was surrounded on all sides. Supplies dwindled. Water was poisoned. Canoes filled the lake, not with merchants now, but with warriors bearing obsidian blades. Montezuma, still held within the Spanish palace, was now both captive and symbol. The people demanded he be freed. Alvarado refused. Days passed. The siege grew tighter. The market of Tlatlauco was abandoned. No food, no water, no escape. Spanish soldiers stood on the ramparts, sleepless, watching the fires flicker in the night, hearing drums that no longer sang, but threatened. The city had changed. It was no longer soft, no longer curious. It had become a beast with stone teeth, ancient, furious, awake. And then Cortés returned. Having defeated Narvaez on the coast and absorbed his men into his own force, Cortés rushed back with reinforcements, arriving to find his army trapped, the city in open revolt, and Montezuma a prisoner in a cage of his own former empire. He was furious with Alvarado, but it no longer mattered. What had been set in motion could not be undone. Now, Cortés stood in the same place where he had once been welcomed with incense and gold, only to find spears at every gate, hatred in every eye. His letters described the people as having changed completely, but it was he who had changed them. What followed were days of confusion barricades, small skirmishes. The Spaniards, despite their firearms and horses, were vastly outnumbered. The city was a maze, and the canals were no longer serene. In desperation, Cortés turned once again to Montezuma. He brought him to the rooftop of the palace, hoping the emperor's voice could calm the city, restore order, perhaps even save the invaders who still called themselves guests. Montezuma, dressed in royal robes, stepped to the parapet. The people below looked up, thousands of them, warriors, priests, women, children, all watching. He raised his hand. He began to speak, but they no longer listened. Some shouted at him to stand aside. Others called him a traitor, and then from somewhere below, a stone was hurled, perhaps from a sling, perhaps thrown by hand. It struck Montezuma in the face. Blood ran down his cheek. The emperor fell back. Some say he wept. Others say he said nothing. A few claimed he murmured to himself, "I am no longer needed." Days later, Montezuma died, whether from his wounds, from despair, or by secret Spanish hands. No one can say for certain. The chroniclers disagree, but the result was the same. The voice of the empire was silent. The gods were watching, and the lake would soon run red from the courtyards of the temple to the shadows of the palace. The Mexica had seen enough. They would no longer tolerate the strangers in their city. The city would burn, and the Spaniards would flee into the night. There are nights in history that feel endless, nights where the stars hide and time seems to stretch like a wound. One such night came in the summer of 1520, as shadows lengthened over the stone canals of Tenochtitlan. The Spaniards had overstayed their welcome. They were no longer honored guests, nor tolerated infidels. They were now intruders, thieves, desecrators, and the city had made its judgment. The bridges were cut. The causeways were sealed, and every alley whispered of death. Cortés understood the trap he was in. His army, now swollen with Narvaez's former men, was larger than before, but no safer. Supplies were critically low. Horses starved. Gunpowder dwindled. The lakes, once a mirror of sky and calm, now shimmered with hostile canoes. And Montezuma was dead. His corpse, once the vessel of divine authority, lay somewhere within the palace walls, though the city no longer mourned him. The people had moved on. They were listening now to a new voice, that of his brother, Cuauhtémoc, who had taken the mantle of Tenochtitlan. Cuauhtémoc did not parley. He did not flatter. He declared war. Cortés had only one option left. He would flee the city under cover of night. The plan was desperate, but clear. His men would load what treasure they could carry, silence their weapons, and slip out across the western causeway, which led to the mainland town of Tlacopan. From there, they hoped to escape into Tlaxcalan lands, friendly territory, regroup, and strike again. But nothing ever leaves Tenochtitlan unnoticed. On the night of June 30th, 1520, under a moon veiled by clouds, the Spaniards began their retreat. They moved silently, step by careful step. Soldiers, horses, Tlaxcalan allies, women, porters, all weighed down with weapons and sacks of gold. Some even melted treasure into bars, strapping them to their chests. The greed that had drawn them here had not released them. At first, it worked. They passed through the broken gates, guided by a soldier who had grown familiar with the city's labyrinth. They crossed the first bridge, where Cortés himself led the column, their boots muffled with cloth. But the causeway was long and narrow and broken in places, for the Mexica had dismantled the bridges between segments, leaving wide gaps filled with black water. Cortés had ordered a portable bridge built by his carpenters, a wooden span that could be laid over each canal, then lifted and carried forward. But as they reached the first break in the causeway, the city stirred. Somewhere in the darkness, a watcher raised a cry. A shell trumpet blew, long, shrill, mournful. And then, from the shadows of the lake, the Mexica came. They came in canoes, silent, fast, many, from side canals, from rooftops, from behind stone walls. Drums thundered to life, not the drums of ceremony, but of war. The retreat turned to chaos. Arrows rained from the darkness. Stones flew. Canoes rammed the edges of the causeway. Warriors leapt from boats, climbing onto the narrow path, hacking at Spaniards with obsidian-edged clubs. The portable bridge stuck at the first canal, heavy with blood and bodies. Men behind had nowhere to go. Panic took over. Horses reared and fell into the lake. Soldiers slipped in their armor, dragged down by the weight of gold. Gunpowder turned wet and useless. Sacks of treasure were dropped or clutched desperately, and those who clung to their plunder often paid for it with their lives. The lake swallowed them. Corpses floated beside glittering bars of gold. One Spanish soldier, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, would later write that the screams were like nothing he had ever heard. Cries of drowning men, horses shrieking, the terrible splash of bodies striking water and not returning. Cortés himself barely escaped, wounded, cut across the face and hand. His beloved horse was lost beneath him, drowned in the lake. His captains fell around him. Pedro de Alvarado, somehow, made a legendary leap across one of the broken canals, vaulting with his lance, though some say it's a myth. By morning, the causeway was a butcher's bridge. The Mexica had achieved what no other native force in the New World had yet done. They defeated a European army on their own soil. Hundreds of Spaniards were dead. Over 4,000 of their native allies had perished. Cannon, horses, swords, crossbows, supplies, all lost. And the gold, much of it sank with the dead, a mockery of greed, glinting beneath the lake's surface. The survivors, bloody and broken, staggered toward the trees of Tlacopan. There Cortés sat beneath an old cypress and wept. He did not hide it. Witnesses say he sobbed openly for his men, for the lost treasure, for the city that had once welcomed him, and now cast him out with iron and fire. This night would forever be called La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. But for the Mexica, it was a night of pride, of revenge, of power reclaimed. The foreigners had been punished. The gods, perhaps, were watching once more, and yet victory is never simple, nor final. Cortés, though shattered, would not disappear. He would gather new allies, rebuild his forces, and return not with curiosity, but with cold fury. And next time, he would not seek to charm the empire. He would seek to destroy it. But that is a story for another night. The lake remembers. The causeways hold echoes of that long, dark retreat, and beneath the surface, the gold still sleeps. After the bitter retreat of La Noche Triste, the survivors stumbled into the forests and hills west of the lake. Many were maimed, delirious, starved. Their armor rusted with blood, their eyes hollowed by grief. Behind them, the island city burned in celebration, its temples echoing with drums not of mourning, but triumph. But Cortés, he did not yield, even with half his force gone, even as wounds festered and morale collapsed. He saw not an end, but a beginning. From the high ground of Tlacopan, as the smoke of Tenochtitlan drifted on the breeze, he made a vow. He would return, and this time not to conquer, but to annihilate. First, he turned to diplomacy. The Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Mexica, welcomed him again. They had lost many warriors in the retreat, but they still saw value in alliance, and now, with their support, Cortés began gathering something far more powerful than swords: resentment. Village by village, he moved through the Valley of Mexico, rallying those crushed by Aztec tribute, peoples who had long paid in crops, blood, and children. The empire had enemies aplenty, and Cortés offered them revenge. By the winter of 1520, he had thousands under his command, native warriors with hatred in their hearts, and Spaniards who had tasted humiliation. But time was running against the Mexica too. In Tenochtitlan, their new emperor Cuauhtémoc, who had rallied them after Montezuma's death and led the victory on La Noche Triste, was struck down by a terrible enemy. No sword could fight smallpox. It swept through the city like a silent fire, brought unknowingly by the Spaniards in blankets, breath, and skin. It spared no class, priests, children, warriors, even the nobility. Cuauhtémoc died gasping for air, his face disfigured, his body fevered. The city mourned, yes, but fear had begun to creep into even the proudest hearts. The disease had no name in their tongue, only a memory of sores and shadows. And so the mantle passed to a young warrior named Cuauhtémoc, the descending son, Montezuma's nephew, barely in his 20s. His spirit was iron, his words fire, and though he ruled an empire now crumbling at its edges, he would defend it with the fury of the gods. He knew what was coming. In early 1521, Cortés returned to the lake, but this time not through causeways. This time he came by water. He had learned. He had brought with him a terrifying new force, brigantines, small warships built on the lake shore, assembled from timber hauled across mountains, forged with Spanish iron and native labor, 13 of them, each armed with cannon, sail, and rowers. And as they slid into the calm waters of Lake Texcoco, shimmering like silver predators, the people of Tenochtitlan watched in awe and dread. The lake that had once been their shield was now a battleground. Cortés began to encircle the island. He established camps at the 3 main causeways, Tacuba, Iztapalapa, and Tepeyac, blocking access in and out. He sent brigantines to cut off canoes bringing food or reinforcements. Day by day, the ring tightened. But Cuauhtémoc was no passive defender. He turned every canal into a trench, every rooftop into a fortress, every alley into a trap. Warriors fought from canoes, ambushed from the water. Dams were broken to flood parts of the causeway. Obsidian blades flashed from the shadows. Spanish horses, so feared in open battle, found little room to maneuver in the tight streets. And still, Cortés pressed forward. It was not a siege of weeks, but months. From May to August 1521, the battle dragged on a house by house, step by bloody step. The Spaniards described it as fighting in a labyrinth of fire. Temples burned. Water turned black with ash and blood. The screams never stopped. Every victory was Pyrrhic. Every street gained was won with steel and fire, and still the people resisted. Women hurled stones from windows. Children carried water to warriors. Priests stood in the temple courts, chanting to Huitzilopochtli, praying for a storm to strike down the invaders. One Spanish chronicler wrote that the city fought with the strength of 10 Romes. But starvation crept in like a thief. The causeways were blocked, the lake controlled, the crops destroyed, fish nets torn, the markets silenced. Famine followed, then thirst, then disease. Still, the people fought. In one moment of terrifying resolve, a group of Mexico warriors captured a group of Spaniards and Tlaxcalan allies and sacrificed them at the top of the Templo Mayor, cutting open their chests as the sun rose. From his warship on the lake, Cortés could see the blood run down the steps. It was not only a ritual, it was a message. We are still here. We still remember. The gods still see. But gods could not stop gunpowder. Bit by bit, the island was consumed. The great aqueducts were shattered. The causeways broken, then remade by Spanish engineers. Entire districts were razed with fire and cannon. Brigantines patrolled every canal, turning water into walls of death. By July, the city was half rubble, its temples cracked, its homes in ruins. And yet Cuauhtémoc would not surrender, even as his people starved in the streets, as the last stores of maize ran dry. As children cried in the dark, he refused to abandon the fight. He was not protecting a city. He was protecting memory, but history, cruel as it is, would not yield. In the final days of the siege, With Tenochtitlan reduced to ash and mud, Cortés made one final push, a relentless march into the city's broken heart. And there, in the smoking remains of what had once been an empire's jewel, a young emperor waited, not with hope, but with dignity. By early August 1521, Tenochtitlan was no longer a city. It was a memory held together by dust and willpower. Where once towers of white limestone rose above glittering canals, there now lay broken temples, flooded causeways, and the black bones of homes. The once sacred center of Mexican life had become a graveyard with no silence. Smoke drifted constantly. The air reeked of fire, blood, and rot. The siege had lasted 3 months. The city had suffered starvation, disease, and destruction on a scale few could comprehend. Its people, once among the most prosperous in the continent, now scavenged for bark, roots, rats. Even the dogs had disappeared. Many were eaten. Others had become feral and dangerous. And still, Cuauhtémoc stood. The young emperor had become more than a ruler. He was the flame that refused to die. Even among the ruins, he wore the tattered symbols of his office, the eagle feather crown, the gold earspools, the painted cloak, though stained with ash and dust. Every morning, he rallied what warriors remained. Every evening, he met with his council beneath a collapsing roof, planning defenses for a city that no longer had streets. He had nothing left to protect except honor. The Spaniards, by contrast, were exhausted but relentless. Cortés had sworn to take the city, no matter the cost. His allies, the Tlaxcalans and others, saw the siege as more than conquest. It was revenge. Every day they poured into the city with more fury, tearing down the homes of their former oppressors, burning what they could not steal. On the 13th of August, 1521, the end finally came. Cuauhtémoc was aboard a canoe, attempting to flee across the shattered canals with a small group of retainers. Some say he was looking for food. Others believe he sought to rally defenders in a different district. A few whisper that he meant to escape into the hills and rebuild the resistance. But the lake had eyes. A brigantine spotted him. The chase was swift. Spanish oars cut the water like knives. Crossbowmen raised their weapons. Cannon crews barked commands. The Mexica canomen tried to outpace the ship, but their arms were too weak, their spirits too tired. Within moments, the emperor was surrounded. The Spaniards approached slowly, almost reverently. Here was no ordinary captive. Here was the son of kings, the last true sovereign of the Mexica world, brought low not by sword, but by time. When they seized him, Cuauhtémoc did not beg. Instead, he stood tall within the rocking canoe, his voice steady despite the hunger and illness in his frame. He turned to Hernán Cortés, who had ridden out to receive him. According to Spanish accounts, Cuauhtémoc said, "I have done what was my duty in defense of my city and my people. Now I come before your power. Take the dagger you carry at your belt and strike me now." Cortés did not. Perhaps he was struck by the defiance. Perhaps he wanted to parade his victory. Perhaps, in that moment, he saw not an enemy, but a reflection of a man who had lost everything for a cause. Cuauhtémoc was taken alive. The city, sensing its last breath leave, fell into silence. And thus ended the city of Tenochtitlan, not in one great blow, but in slow collapse. Not with surrender, but with the fall of a single canoe. Cortés entered the ruined city that afternoon. What he saw stunned even him. He had dreamed of gold, of temples, of cities of light. Instead, he walked through mud, corpses, and silence. The stench was overwhelming. Flies swarmed over heaps of dead. Starving dogs gnawed the flesh of former priests. Smoke still drifted from the shell of the Templo Mayor. Victory, it seemed, had an aftertaste. The Mexica survivors, some wounded, some begging, many numb, were gathered and enslaved. The women were taken as spoils. The nobles, stripped of their ornaments. Temples were razed. Statues of gods broken, their heads rolled into the lake. The heart of an empire had been extinguished. Cortés ordered a Christian cross raised at the site of the main temple, and nearby he had a mass celebrated. Where once sacrifices had been made to Huitzilopochtli, now prayers were whispered to Christ. It was not peace, it was replacement. Cuauhtémoc remained a prisoner. At first, Cortés allowed him to live in relative dignity. He needed him to pacify the remaining cities, and many still revered the emperor. But suspicion always followed power, and gold always whispered from shadows. Some months later, rumors spread that Cuauhtémoc was conspiring with other native rulers, that he planned to rise again, that somewhere, somehow, the empire might return. Cortés had him tortured, demanding the location of hidden treasure. According to some chroniclers, Cuauhtémoc was bound, and his feet were slowly roasted over a fire, along with another noble. The pain must have been unspeakable. When the other man began to cry out, Cuauhtémoc turned to him and said, "Do you think I am resting on a bed of roses?" It is a line that has echoed through centuries, not just a mark of courage, but a symbol of the dignity with which an entire world died. Eventually, Cuauhtémoc was executed. Cortés, years later, claimed it was for a plot he uncovered during an expedition to Honduras. Whether the threat was real or imagined, the young emperor was hanged from a ceiba tree in the jungle. And so, in a foreign land far from the lake that raised him, the last true king of Tenochtitlan fell. But some say his soul returned with the eagles. That when the wind howls over the lake, when the shadows stretch long at dusk, you can still hear him whispering not for vengeance, but remembrance. Not all empires leave ruins. Some leave only names, and some a silence that echoes louder than any trumpet. By the end of 1521, nothing of the old Tenochtitlan stood unbroken. Its temples were dismantled stone by stone. Its canals, once so alive with color and commerce, were drained or choked with rubble. The floating gardens that once fed hundreds of thousands turned brown, abandoned to rot and silence. And yet, the soul of Tenochtitlan would not vanish so easily. In the place of the once magnificent island city, a new one rose, Mexico City, the capital of a Spanish colony called New Spain. Cortés, now governor in all but name, ordered churches built atop temples, palaces upon ruins. The very stones of the Templo Mayor, sacred to the Mexica for generations, were repurposed to construct cathedrals. It was more than conquest. It was erasure, a deliberate rewriting of memory in brick and mortar. But stones do not forget. Walk through the historic center of Mexico City today, and the street grid still follows the old Aztec city's outline. The Zócalo, the great plaza where ceremonies were once held before the gods, remains a place of gathering. Beneath the cathedral's shadow, parts of the ancient Templo Mayor have been excavated, serpent heads, stairs, fragments of gods no longer worshipped, but still watching. In the dust beneath the city, the Mexica still speak, and their legacy lives on in ways their conquerors could never have foreseen. The very name Mexico is not Spanish. It is Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica. It comes from Mexico, the heart of the Aztec world. The name survived the flames, the swords, the sickness. It could not be burned away. Nahuatl words still echo in daily speech: chocolate, tomato, avocado, coyote, mezcal. Their food endured, their traditions, though reshaped by time and colonization, persisted. Even the calendar, the myths, the vision of a universe powered by sacrifice and balance, remains embedded in the Mexican psyche. The eagle on the cactus, devouring a serpent, the symbol the Mexica followed across the desert until they built Tenochtitlan, now rests at the center of the Mexican flag. It is a strange legacy, to be both destroyed and remembered. What the Spanish took with fire, time gave back with reverence. And what of Cortés? He returned to Spain years later, frustrated and disillusioned. The empire he had delivered was no longer in his hands. The King of Spain grew suspicious of his power and influence. He died wealthy, yes, but never again as revered as he was in those first years, wading through the blood of empires. Some say he requested to be buried in Mexico, near the ruins of Tenochtitlan. His bones, after years of being moved from church to church, now rest behind stone walls few visit. He conquered a world, and yet became a ghost within it. As for Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, he became more than a man. He became a symbol. In Mexico, his name is honored in avenues, statues, schools. He represents resistance, courage, defiance, in the face of overwhelming force. His dignity, even in defeat, has endured longer than any gold, any temple, any crown. When modern Mexico sought to reclaim its identity after centuries of colonial rule, it did not look to Cortés. It looked to Cuauhtémoc, because history has two halves, the facts and the feelings. And while the facts show a brutal conquest, The feelings carried by storytellers, grandmothers, murals, and poetry keep the memory of the fallen alive. Some ask, was the fall of the Aztec Empire inevitable? It is easy to look back and see fate written in the stars. To say the Spanish had steel, horses, guns, and ships, that they were always going to win. But the truth is more complex and more human. Had Montezuma acted differently, had the Tlaxcalans stood with Tenochtitlan instead of against it, had smallpox not arrived when it did, history might have whispered another ending. But it did not. And so here we are centuries later, listening in the dark, as the rain falls lightly outside your window, imagining cities that no longer stand, gods whose altars are cold, and warriors whose bones rest beneath the pavement of modern life. Perhaps you are lying in bed, eyes closed, somewhere far from Mexico. Or maybe you're listening from a place not so distant, where your own ancestors once gazed at the stars and wondered if the world would always be as it was. Tell me, my friend, where are you listening from? What time is it for you? What dreams will you carry with you into sleep tonight? Because though the empires crumble, the stories remain. They are buried not in stone, but in hearts. And now, so gently, so quietly, we lay this story to rest. Close your eyes. Let the water of Lake Texcoco lap softly at the shores of your dreams. Let the drums fade into silence. Let Cuauhtémoc's voice echo just once more, not in pain, but in pride. For you have witnessed the rise and fall of a world. And now you may rest. Candle, if you found comfort, knowledge, or wonder in this story, I invite you to subscribe so we may journey through history together again soon. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love reading your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, sleep well, dream deep, and remember, the past is never truly gone. It only waits for someone to remember it. Good night.